lecture about Christianity as Milton might have encountered it in some of its various forms. I'm going to take us through Christianity in general, touching on the various important distinctions between Roman Catholicism, Protestantism, Anglicanism, Presbyterianism, Puritanism, and Quakerism, and end with a little bit of thought about Milton. So I'm going to plunge through fairly fast on this. Let's start with an overview of Christianity. Obviously, considers itself a monotheistic religion, one God replacing pantheistic approaches. However, as I said in class today, a Trinitarian God with a confusing interplay of one God, but in three manifestations. It held always to its prophetic basis in Judaism, the Old Testament, and in Judaic study, in Talmudic study. Milton knew many rabbis and was very fluent in Hebrew and was very concerned, as were most Christians, to find a basis in the scripture of the Old Testament, which was included with the New Testament as part of the Christian Bible. Christianity held that there was a radical break when Christ came was incarnate, became human, that there was a radical break between what they called the old dispensation and the new, or the old covenant and the new, covenant being that covenant that God had made in the Old Testament with Abraham. The new covenant replacing that, replacing an act of sacrifice and of obedience to one of grace and acceptance. It is an incarnational religion in general. That is, it believes that it is possible the human life can incorporate God and does incorporate God. Deep in that was an actual epistemology, ontology, in which the soul present in every human being was seen as directly coming from God and returning to God. It is also a salvationist religion. That is, it is concerned with not only the precursor of salvation, which is the state of sin. It is concerned with our being inadequate to the world, and finding in religious practice and faith a sense that salvation is possible. This is true across the board, I would say, from Catholic to Puritan, that a great focus was on saving the soul from, and this is where it differed, from forms of damnation or peril. So let's turn to Roman Catholicism. Here's a picture from the Renaissance fresco of an early pope, a medieval pope, Pope Gregory, who nonetheless the artist has given the features of a contemporary pope, of Julius II from the Renaissance. He's wearing the tiaras, the triple crown that Milton speaks about, the mitre and the apostolic robes of the pope. And of course, you've seen pictures of present-day popes in that. We're talking about a dominant European religion dating from, of course, I said early medieval on the slide. It's even earlier than that, of course, from the fall of Rome. It is a religion based in Rome and ruled by the Pope, and based in apostolic and papal history. The belief was that St. Peter, apostle of Christ, became the first bishop of Rome and the Pope, and that Jesus had said to Peter, "You are the rock on which I build my church." Patrum means rock, and it's a pun, but it's also a metaphor that they took very seriously. So naturally, it is an authoritarian religion. It's based on hierarchy and on the belief that there are divinely inspired men, largely, completely, who can mediate between us. It is largely Latinate, of course. It's based in Rome and draws on Latin as the international language, and Latin, of course, as originally the language of Roman work. It Catholicism tends to read the Bible in Latin. That Latin Bible in Milton's day was known as the Vulgate, Vulgate. Um, and so, of course, the reading of the Bible in Roman Catholicism in Milton's time was restricted to those who were educated in Latin. It is a right-centered religion. That is, it is a religion which teaches and practices the importance of religious celebration and ceremony. In those rites, whether public or private, whether large scale in a cathedral or small scale at the deathbed, nonetheless are rituals, are actions considered to have a sacramental and a salvationist point of view. Trinitarian, we've talked about that briefly. It is priestly religion. That's one of the links between Roman Catholicism and Judaic religion from the Old Testament. The sense of a high priest who held rituals at the temple in Jerusalem, that the temple itself was sacred, and that the priest himself was sacred, is really important to Roman Catholicism as well. All right, now let's move on to Protestantism in general. And from Protestantism, we'll move to several sects of Protestantism, but this is the large scale division. So Protestantism, basically beginning with Martin Luther in the early 16th century, whose picture you see here, a monk, a Catholic monk who particularly reading St. Paul and the letter to the Romans, which is one of the books of the New Testament Bible, believed that, I'll skip down to the fourth bullet point here, that salvation by faith and not works was what Paul was writing about and what Jesus preached. That what this means roughly is that he felt that works was the center of the Roman Catholic religion. That is, that by doing good things, you could achieve your salvation. By working out in the world, by doing good things, by taking care of the poor, by giving your money away, by being a good person, acting well, would create salvation. Luther, reading the Bible again, said, it's not what I see is happening. I see salvation by faith, that only those who actually in their mind have faith that Christ died for them, for us, for that particular person, for you, only by faith in that will you achieve salvation. If you have faith in that, Christ will do it all for you, and you actually don't need to do good works. You will be inspired to do good works if you're finding salvation, but that is not a precursor of salvation. Therefore, the fifth biblical point, it is clearly a religion with an emphasis on the individual person, rather than a ritual-centered religion. It is about each of us finding his or her own path towards salvation. Therefore, local authority became very important in Protestantism. It was a breakaway religion from the hierarchical, universalizing mode of the Roman Catholic Church. Local authority, congregations, individual congregations became super important. Our own college, Oberlin College, founded as a Congregationalist institution in the 1830s, was very much based in that concept of Protestantism. That is, that there was no one form of congregational or of Christian worship, that each congregation, including this one on its own out in this swamp in Ohio, could and needed to find its own form of governance and achieve perfection and salvation on its own. Finally, the third bullet point, it was a Bible-centered religion, unlike Roman Catholicism, in that it encouraged the reading of the Bible by everybody. And so it also depended on a translation or translations of the Bible into the vernacular, that is, the language that people spoke in whatever place they were living. So Luther worked on writing hymns in German, translating the Bible. Calvin translated the Bible. And one of the first acts of King James as a new king of England in 1603 was to convene the Bible Translation Committee, which was to produce the 1611 King James Bible, which Milton refers to often, but was not the only form of the Bible that Milton read. Just a little visual help to clarify this. Here's the interior of St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, the home of the Pope, ornately decorated, focused on the altar that you see at the very back. The hierarchical, that is, Pope would sit in the throne behind that altar. The altar sitting under a great dome which takes us up hierarchically towards heaven and God. Put that next to another 17th century painting of a Dutch church in the 17th century. The Dutch were, at least northern Holland was a Protestant country. And here we have an emphasis on, as opposed to darkness, in St. Peter's and mystery, we have an emphasis on light and enlightenment, on clarity, on the absence of clutter, on neatness, and on a space that, while equally grand, not as big as St. Peter's, but still grand and vaulted, still seems more to lend itself to contemplation and introspection. So let's turn from a general point of view, survey of Protestantism, to a survey of some of the key sects or divisions of Protestantism. First, let's do Anglicanism. So this would be also called the Church of England, Anglican meaning English. It was established, it is an established church, that's established with a capital E, because it was created by the King of England, Henry VIII, and ruled by the King of England. Now, there is an Archbishop of Canterbury. This is a portrait of William Laud, the Archbishop of Canterbury, when Milton was growing up, who is the actual administrative head of the King of the Church of England. But the King or Queen, even at this point, is called the Defender of the Faith and is the head of the Church of England. Therefore, the church is a state-subsidized church. It is even today, and in Milton's time, it was the single church, and you were required to go there. Shakespeare's father had not gone to church in the Anglican Church, and that absence was duly noted, and he was demoted from his position on the Council of Stratford and fined heavily for not showing up at church. So it's a state-centered church. There were monarchs. There were bishops who are members of the House of Lords, one of the two houses of Parliament. We talked about the King James Version, the Anglican Church, founded by King James's probably great-great-grandfather, Henry VIII, on his seeking his divorce from his first wife, could not get it from the Pope, and decided to break away. It is a Protestantism that is relatively close to Catholic, however, though it is Protestant, it's relatively close to Catholic in that it has an emphasis on ritual. There is a Book of Common Prayer, it is a prescribed set of prayers which ministers were supposed to use on certain days. It emphasized uniformity, as many established churches must. And basically tried to tread a kind of compromise line between being a Reformed church, a Protestant protesting church, but also being true to what it considered its heritage from Catholicism. So Anglicanism, which has always been a relatively conservative in certain forms, ways of thinking about that word, religion. It is today in America, it is the Episcopal Church is closest to that, although Lutheranism shares many aspects of an interest in ritual and ceremony with Episcopalianism and Anglicanism. So this is the big elephant in the room for anybody growing up in the 17th century. It runs the universities, it runs the government, it has money and power, and anybody else is going to be a marginalized institution or marginalized person. Well, where do we turn when we go away from the center? We turn towards Presbyterianism. Now, this was a Scots-based religion. So Scotland and England are separate countries until 1603, when they're united under the single king, James VI of Scotland, and James I of England, who succeeded Elizabeth I after her long reign in England. Now, James was not a Presbyterian, but he ruled over a country that largely was. This Presbyterianism had been founded by John Knox back in the time of Luther in Scotland, and it was largely a congregationalist religion. That is, each congregation had its own working rules. However, Presbyterianism, as it developed in Scotland, also had a hierarchical organization. So there were elders, and congregations were ruled by those elders and by synods, that is, groups of churches with an authority over others. It was a highly Bible-centered religion and still is. Reading the Bible in English was essential. It was a religion that favored introspection and conscience, that preached about sin. If you read pretty much anything in Scottish literature from the 17th through the 19th century, you'll see its incredible interest in sin. Just one example would be Robert Louis Stevenson's great Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, which, while it nominally takes place in London, almost certainly is thought he was thinking about it as taking place in his native Edinburgh, where a kind of deep sin lurks through the city, like Hyde, like the monster Hyde, living underneath our nice bourgeois front. Presbyterianism emphasized the doctrines of John Calvin. John Calvin had preached in Geneva at the beginning of the Reformation and created Geneva as a city roughly of Presbyterians. They didn't call them that, but it's a pretty close link. And what's central about Calvin's premises is that sin was inevitable. Sin is in all of us. But some of us have been elected from the beginning of time to overcome sin and to go to heaven. That is, God has a book up there in which your name is on one column and my name is in a column, and we hope it's on the column of the saved. We don't know until we introspect deep in our souls and ask ourselves if we really are feeling the grace of God or not. It's a highly introspective, highly self-critical, and critical religion. So it's a kind of religion, like early Oberlin, in which sinners could be denounced from the pulpit for their own good, to turn away and recognize the grace. See, you had the right to ignore the grace of God, and if you did, that was really bad. Moving on. Puritanism. Now, Puritanism is beginning in Milton's birth time, born in 1608, and is growing as a radical alternative to Anglicanism. It's essentially starting out of Anglicanism, but asking Anglicans to be more true to the tenets of the Bible. It urged that churches should be independent of the state. American Constitution, of course, gains a great deal from Puritanism, and the separation of church and state is one of those forms. It had a congregational emphasis. It favored having ministers, not priests. That is, ministers who would preach the gospel so that you could learn about the Bible and about sin and grace, but not with the authority to absolve you from your sins, which Roman Catholic and Anglican believed in. Salvation comes as a gift of Christ, not through your own good works. But God does favor those elect that he has marked from the beginning. It's like Calvinism in that sense. A very strong emphasis on individual liberty. Puritans took over the government in the 1640s and the state, and some of those struggles we'll talk about later in the course. Finally, Quakerism had its birth in this day. George Fox is the originator of Quakerism, and took a far more radical approach towards religious rites and practices than any of the other sects that I've talked about. Quaker meetings are silent and were then. Silence is as important as preaching, is more important than preaching, because your struggle is to find God inside of you, or what they called the inner light. So it emphasizes conscience and individuality. There was no minister, merely a convener of the session. It believes strongly in radical democratic concepts, the equality of women, the abolition of slavery, in pacifism, concepts that would get you put in jail, and did, in fact, put George Fox in jail. Milton was, in his later life, was very friendly with a number of Quakers. They helped him survive the return of the monarchy, and I think he would well have become a Quaker had he lived a generation later. John Milton, to sum up, had a Catholic grandfather, as most Englishmen would have, but a relatively Puritan upbringing. That is to say, he was brought up in the Anglican Church in the shadow of St. Paul's Cathedral, center of London Anglicanism. He studied to be an Anglican minister, though he never took holy orders. But it's quite clear that many influences from his youth were also Puritan. He was definitely a Calvinist, believing in predestination, but hated the kind of Presbyterian authority that he saw taking over in Scotland. He was always for religious liberty, our freedom to find our own life. That's my clock running the hour, and I'm going to finish this up in a second. He believed always that the basis of Christianity lay in a rigorous, learned search for truth. He knew his privilege was to be learned in the languages, in sciences, in sociology, in history, and knew that many others were not, but thought of himself writing his poems in order to bring a sense of truth, that is, originality, originary truth, truth that goes back to the beginnings of Christianity, bringing that to his fellow Christians, both through poetry and prose writing. We're not going to read his prose, and through his political actions as Foreign Secretary for Cromwell's radical Puritan government.